someone like myself might work in 20 sessions with somebody and get them to stop binge eating and purging. But behind all that might have been a history of sexual abuse. Behind all that is generally real legitimate pain. And now we can start having a reasonable conversation about psychoanalytic interventions and that process of recovery and growth and so forth. So we shouldn't be talking about therapies in terms of schools. We're way beyond that. These therapy schools, these treatment packages, we should be talking about what works for whom and why. And that doesn't happen in the psychoanalytic world. It almost feels cult-like to me.
I agree with you. I have my own issues with psychoanalysis, having studied it for such a long time, having lived in the psychoanalytic world. I've been in analysis for 6 years, like therapy for the first 4 and then analysis for the last couple. And I totally get that it sometimes can seem kind of cult-like. I have no idea the literature on psychoanalysis for acute conditions. But also, like, the other thing that I think is really constrictive is like the system that we're living in is just not realistic. When you get someone who comes into an emergency room and says, I feel like killing myself, that if they don't have insurance, like, that hospital bill is going to be insane. They're not going to want to pay for more therapy. If they do have insurance, their insurance company is going to say, okay, here's 15 sessions to not kill yourself. You're going to be fine after that, right? You're totally good. So, like, you clearly can't do psychoanalysis in 15 sessions. You have to work with what you have, which I totally agree that, like, I really, in terms of like people who practice psychoanalytically in New York, I can't think of a single one who practices only psychoanalysis. Everybody's interdisciplinary. So I think that unless you like go to, NIPSI, the New York Psychoanalytic Institute, and like see the 400-year-old people there who still are practicing like Freud did, which, like, that is definitely a dying breed. I think people are recognizing the realities of the world and kind of having to acclimate to those. But I do see there are issues in psychoanalysis. It is very, it can be very exclusive. And I think they're trying to not have that, maybe be a little more inclusive, but there are definitely some issues. I mean, with any academic field, there are issues. With any therapy field, there are issues. I mean, do not even get me started on the cult of AEDP. I mean, that stuff is over the line for me, and I'm sure there are a lot more like it. So yeah, I think it's definitely not a problem that's exclusive to psychoanalysis, for sure.
I'm interested, maybe going back to the social media component. In terms of, I mean, you guys went deep in the weeds on 2 different approaches to therapy, which was interesting. But when it comes to, engaging in social media, do you believe there is a role for mental health professionals and therapists to engage in that space?
Yeah,
Okay.
for sure. And I think, actually, funny enough, I have looked at your Substack, Roger, and I like some of the stuff you have to say. I really like the thing that was like five things to help your children understand mental health. I can't remember the name of the article, but it was like stuff like teaching them resilience, teaching them frustration tolerance. Like, I think that in terms of therapists participating in the world around them, there's absolutely a place for psychoeducation, because I think that the world right now, with the psychotic age of the internet and everything's going through, like, we need someone to come in and tell us, like, hey, everybody, just relax. Like, this is what being a human is. We need to almost relearn some of these very basic tenets of being a person. And so I think that that is definitely the place for mental health professionals to say, like, we are in a mental health crisis. We're here to help. And also, like, this is maybe a little bit of a hot take, but I don't think that if a mental health professional sees something that is not necessarily a strictly political thing, but something that aligns with identity politics issues, yet they see it as a mental health crisis or something that could turn into a mental health crisis, I do appreciate when I see someone speak up in a way that is respectful, that's dignified, that's well educated, someone who writes papers about things that they see. I think that that is something I really like. I like to see people engaging in what's going on now, because, like, otherwise we really don't have a voice for how crazy the world is. I mean, my whole thing is everybody has mental health, so everyone thinks that they're a mental health expert, but that's just not true. There are mental health experts out there.
Yeah, I guess that's where I'm struggling is, now that Roger's been engaged in that social media space for the last 2 years, I've seen labels of extremist viewpoints. And I'm always curious, like, at what's considered an extremist viewpoint and to whom? because depending on where you are and your awareness of certain things, it may feel extreme to you. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts on that in terms of somebody who works in the field becoming aware of certain topics that might be a little more controversial, trying to bring attention to those things and doing so in a way, because you used the word incendiary to kind of describe Roger at first, and maybe some of the content does come across that way, but the way that he's engaging in that space, is it being done in a way that is professional to educate, or is it being done in a way that's trying to elicit a response?
That's a fascinating question. I love that question. I think for me, the definition of extremism is something that is said diametrically, something that's said without the possibility of engaging in another side. That you just have one view of the world, and that is the only view of the world, and any other views of the world are not, they just don't exist. They're seen as psychotic. You need to do like reality testing on someone because they think that genders exist. It's like, that's a little bit of an extremist view. But I would say that only someone who is posting their own content can look at their own content and determine whether or not they are open to the possibility of engaging with someone. I think oftentimes, if you are open to the possibility of engaging with someone from a different sphere than you are, yet you say things that are on the surface seem to shut down the conversation, I think that that's something worth looking at, which I know sometimes I've seen, Roger, on your social media, it's these very kind of like intense statements. And I know talking to you right now that we have views that we disagree on, and it's totally civil, and you're a smart, well-educated guy, and this is a lovely conversation. So it's so, I think, interesting how, and I think that this is really something that social media is doing, something social media is bringing out of us, is that it takes us and it turns us into people who feel like we need to have extremist views in order to get attention. And I don't think that's a thing. I don't think we need it. I think that the more we like open ourselves up to having reasonable dialogue, the more we can make social media a better place.
Yeah, I have a great example of that. So I think a lot of people would take this one statement that I've thrown out there, and I've done podcasts on it, where I say there's no such thing as ADHD. And that gets everybody riled up until they understand what I actually mean by that, because I talk about it with the nuance it deserves. What I say is that attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is a social construction. It's not an identifiable medical illness. It's like nothing you can go into the doctor and test for. You cannot observe it. It is a label put onto a behavior or an action. So even the idea of focus or attention is very difficult to measure, and it could be influenced by many factors. So if Sara falls down the stairs and bumps her head and she thinks she's all right, and then has some memory problems or some focus problems, difficult for her to read in the same way that she did previously, and she's just not herself. Without context, someone could label that as ADHD. She's having difficulty focusing. But the real problem was that she has a traumatic brain injury. Same thing if somebody, is a victim of, childhood abuse and neglect, or someone's a worrier and highly anxious. Their symptoms of attention and hyperactivity are related to other reasons, other causes. Same thing with nutrient deficiencies or other medical conditions. So the label of ADHD is widely applied without understanding its causes, which limits our ability to help somebody. And actually, in fact, it stops investigation. Well, what it does is it sells stimulants. So we have a manufacturing issue with Adderall right now. So many people are trying to get Adderall because it's a performance enhancing drug, at least in the short term. We have this rising number of people who self-identify as ADHD, but so many of them legitimately have phone addiction and aren't active enough, or maybe obese, or maybe depressed. So legitimate reasons why they're not focusing, but they take on an identity of ADHD. ADHD was just created for the general public in 1980. Didn't exist before then. And it's also a label that is placed on people who are just on the spectrum of diversity. You put someone in the classroom, for example, and they're not meant to be there. And they're meant to be active. They can't sit still for long periods of time. They want to be connected to nature, work with their hands, they're creative, whatever that may be. And now they're attaching to this label of ADHD. So on the surface, when I say there's no such thing as ADHD, it sounds extreme because of what they know. They're limited in what is sold to them in the way it's been packaged. But when they have the conversation, if they look at the science or so forth, they get a better understanding of what I mean. Almost everyone who comes into this center at this point says they have ADHD. So it just becomes extremely frustrating. And I feel like I do have a role as a psychologist to be able to have those greater discussions.
So that's as a marketer, I look at just social media as like one channel to communicate a message. So for Roger, maybe it's communicating an idea through Twitter and doing it in the form of 140 characters or whatever. But the idea is like you want to have your message coming out through multiple channels. Let it be the podcast, let it be YouTube as your media vehicle. Then there's TV, print, rate, whatever. But we're limited, as a small scale. I'll call ourselves like a media channel at this point to communicate an idea. So the idea of social media and just using like Twitter as the example, because of the limitation within there, people know the space to be negative. So whatever comes through that might have an opposing viewpoint, the tone that people read those messages automatically comes from a negative perspective. If they can read the same message but adjust the tone in a more conversational way, then I think people won't get as angry to a viewpoint that often goes against theirs. So the platform needs to evolve in a way where it is this open, town hall to have these conversations and these dialogues. I think that's why it's important that everybody's viewpoint is in there and there's no algorithm just kind of limiting what you're being exposed to. What are your thoughts on that, Sarah?
For sure. I totally agree. And I can absolutely relate to this kind of stuff. I mean, knowing SEO, search engine optimization, and all this other stuff that I need to know as a freelancer. I am very schooled in the world of clickbait. I wrote clickbait getting started as a writer, got paid for articles like, the top 7 proteins you need to have right now and stuff like that. And it's kind of how I made my bones. And I recognize that in some ways it's extraordinarily problematic, but it's also in some ways kind of needed because otherwise you really can't get engagement. But I think fundamentally, I mean, of course, it's the world we live in, so we kind of have to like do with it what we can. But I just think it really sucks. I just really wish that we could do things in a different way. And I think like I would love to brainstorm at some point with some people about like, what do we do? How do we change this stuff? Because even though I'm certainly on my Substack guilty of posting titles that I think will, get some sort of, I changed the title of my book for the sake of SEO. My editor and I talked about it. I mean, it's just stuff you need to do in order to get yourself out there as an entrepreneur, someone who has something to say. You have to speak the language of the people that you're speaking to. But I guess my problem isn't necessarily like, in some ways it's like, how are we handling it? Maybe we should be handling it better. But in other ways, it's like the whole concept of this thing we feel like we need to do is just a big bummer, to me at least.
No, I agree. And I want to go back to the original question for you, Roger, about persona and authenticity. Do you feel like your online persona through Twitter has evolved because of the way that social media rewards certain tones or messages? Although your intent is still there, is it your message that's been adjusted based off of what gets traction?
I don't necessarily construct my messages in order to get more views. I think the ones that tend to get the most traction are the ones that really were authentic and emotional in the moment. So it has become a bit of an outlet for me. So you just get done with an evaluation of somebody who was hospitalized. They come out there on 6 psychiatric drugs and they're sleeping 12 hours a day and they had to withdraw from school. And then you learn more about their background and you understand that they are, just suffering from post-traumatic stress and they just really need help, but they've been assigned 5 separate psychiatric diagnoses, and they're pretty much sedated into a lesser version of themselves, and you're heartbroken and you feel helpless because there's nothing more than you can do but to help that one person, but you know this is happening exponentially out there. And so using that as a way of just kind of communicate what I'm seeing, and then people responding and retweeting it, it's another way to disseminate information. And I think the radically genuine nature of that, I think people connect with because it's different than the typical therapist or psychologist persona. And it allows for that message to be communicated more. It's allowed me to go on other podcasts and different shows and be able to communicate this message, which I think is starting to gain traction. I hate the word anti-psychiatry, as you know, but there is a movement that's developed, and psychiatrists are now a part of it too. That we're just moving out of this era of DSM diagnosis and pharmaceutical control, and the distrust of the medical authority.